Okay, are we live? Yes? Great. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Good evening. Welcome to the People's Forum. My name is Leanne. I'm a member of the People's Forum team here, and I'm really thrilled to be inviting this full house for the first session in our three-session course on Lenin and the Path to Revolution. Full house here and a lot of people joining us online from around the world. So I want to extend a big welcome to all of you. Really exciting to see so many faces that I recognize and many new faces as well joining us for this important class series. I want to say before introducing Brian Becker, what an incredible moment to be embarking on this collective study of Lenin and Leninism and what it means for revolutionaries around the world. There's an image I really love about Lenin that's in one of the books that we have here, 1804 books, Reminiscences of Lenin, where Krupskaya is describing in moments of defeat or victory or crisis, he runs to consult Marx. People might be in his living room or something, like arguing and debating or celebrating, and there's a big throng of people, and then he runs and he goes into his study and he consults Marx. And we are in a moment right now, a historical moment that reminds me of this image. Things are changing so dynamically. The question of Palestinian liberation is back on the table in a very concrete and real way. History is turning before our eyes, and I think there's no better time than to go and consult Lenin. So we didn't predict the timing, but I think the timing is actually really beautiful, and is a really important moment to think about what Lenin has to offer, which lessons we can take from Lenin and Leninism, and what revolutionary movements around the world did with Leninism for the moment that we're in right now today. So I want to welcome you all to this course, to embark on this collective study with all of us. We have many books at 1804 Books that include some of Lenin's works. We're going to go through some of them in this course. We have some suggested readings. If you're not signed up for the course mailing list yet and you didn't get the readings, please see myself or my comrade Saidi, who's in the booth right now, to get signed up. And with that, I would like to give a very warm welcome to Comrade Brian Becker. Brian Becker is a founding member of the Party for Socialism and Liberation and also on the Central Committee. And he is the national director of the Answer Coalition, Act Now to Stop Racism and War. Brian, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Leanne, and thanks to all of you for coming. Is the sound okay, Ryan? Okay. I think it's fair to say that the number of people who are here in this room at the People's Forum and the number of people who are online shows that there is a renewed interest not only in Lenin the person, Lenin the revolutionary leader, but an interest in socialism and an interest in Marxism. And whenever you go through periods where there's intense struggle or a renewal in general in socialism, which happens periodically and is happening more and more in the last decade, the interest goes immediately to Karl Marx, to Frederick Engels, and of course to Lenin, who was the next generation of the leader, really, of the next generation of socialist movements in the world, and as a consequence of the Russian Revolution. So the interest in Lenin is really a sign of an interest in socialism. And many, many people around the world, I would say tens of millions of people around the world, we won't learn this in our schools, but tens of millions of people around the world think of themselves as Marxists and as Leninists. You can go to China, you can go, of course, to North Korea, to Vietnam, even in Russia, where socialism and the socialist government was overthrown in 1991. A huge part of the population still admires Lenin, thinks of themselves as socialists, as Marxists in the school of Lenin or in the family of Lenin. And many organizations now identify as Marxist-Leninists. And one of the one of the unfortunate things is a lot of people, including people who identify as Leninists, don't have that much familiarity with Lenin or with Lenin's teachings. And I think in some ways Leninism becomes kind of a brand. And sometimes people who like the brand, identify with it for this or that reason, haven't fully explored what Lenin's teachings signify and indicate. And it's not that easy to study Lenin. Of course, his writings end in 1923 really, March 1923, when he was felled for the last time by a major stroke, and he dies in January 1924. So it's 100 years ago. And he's writing in Russian about things that were happening in Russia very far away. And so if you pick up any one of Lenin's works, and especially the works that are his letters to comrades, his communications with members of the party, they seem a little bit unintelligible. The names are long because they're Russian. You don't know the historical context of the personalities. You don't really know what Lenin's writing about. And one of the problems with people who are adhering to Marxism or to Leninism is that they sometimes think that reading Lenin or Marx is a little bit the way, say, Christians read the Bible, which is they go to the works and they have found the good news, the gospel according to Lenin. And if you read it, and you read it carefully, or you read it a number of times, and perhaps if you memorize it, and you can repeat it, and you can repeat it at the right moment, and have the right quote, then you somehow are in the vein of Lenin or Leninism. But if you read Lenin or Marx or Engels the way a Christian reads the Bible, you won't understand Marxism, you won't certainly understand Lenin or Leninism. And this is particularly true about Lenin, because nothing that Lenin wrote, and I mean literally nothing, was outside of the context of a fight. Everything that Lenin writes is a polemic. Everything is an argument. Everything has an intended target. Everything has, in most cases with Lenin, a central point that is repeated redundantly over and over again, and then some secondary points, but it's mainly one point. And if you don't know who Lenin is fighting with and why he's fighting, if you read those words and try to crib from those words and say, these are the words of Lenin, this is what Leninism means, but you don't understand what the fight is about, you can't really understand what Lenin is trying to say. So a big problem in the study of Lenin is, how do you get into Lenin's head? How do you know what he's talking about? Well, that's a complicated problem, especially for people who are not Russian and who are living 100 years later. So we're trying to sort of deal with Lenin's writings and Lenin's teachings in a way that we understand that most of us, even those of us who consider ourselves Leninists, following the teachings of Lenin, recognize that we have a hard time with a great amount of the content and are likely to misunderstand or misinterpret what Lenin is actually saying in these different writings, in these different polemics. And again, if you treat Lenin's writings as the gospel, rather than a fight, a polemic between a revolutionary who's fighting with other people who are either revolutionaries or reactionaries, you don't really understand what he's talking about. Also, absent historical context, there's more misunderstanding of Lenin. I've been a Leninist, I've been a communist since I was 18 years old. And that was a long time ago. And as soon as I became a communist, when I was originally a liberal, and then I was a kind of a socialist, and then I was a communist, and I was a Leninist, and I was looking to join a Leninist party, and I was 18 years old, and I was like, I don't really fully understand everything that they're talking about, but Lenin has written 46 volumes published by the Soviet Union. I'm going to read all 46 volumes, and I'll try to do it by the time I'm 24, and then I will understand Lenin. Well, guess what? I didn't make it, didn't get through all 46 volumes by the time I was 24, but even the volumes I got through, I didn't understand, even though I thought I understood them. This is the problem of not having historical context to actually understand and appreciate Lenin's writings. For instance, I'm a member of the Party for Socialism and Liberation. I'm one of the founding members. Our branches that are all around the country. Many comrades read What Is to Be Done. They read the book that Lenin wrote in 1902, right before the Second Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, which was the unified Social Democratic Party. All the communists at that time called themselves Social Democrats. And Lenin wrote the pamphlet, What Is to Be Done, before the 1903 Second Congress of the party, the Congress where the Mensheviks and Bolsheviks split into two wings of the party. And communists and young people, including my closest comrades and friends, are reading What Is to Be Done, and they think that What Is to Be Done is a charter document because it represents the reason, the explanation for why there was a split between Lenin and Martov, between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, this historic split. It can be explained by reading What Is to Be Done and studying it. And Lenin's polemics against the economists on the one hand, who were trying to tell the working class that, or tell the society, look, workers only care about wages. They only care about benefits. They only care about what's happening on the job. They don't care about big politics. So let's not talk to them about big politics. Those were the economists, and Lenin was polemicizing against them and said, no, in order for the working class to become revolutionary, you have to talk about revolutionary things, not simply wages and benefits, even though wages and benefits are very, very important for all workers. So he's big polemic against what he calls the economists, those who reduce the class struggle to the sort of bread and butter issues that the economists say the workers can understand this, but they can't grasp big politics. It's over their head. They don't care. They only care about themselves. And then the other side of the polemic in What Is to Be Done is against the Narodniks. And then who are the Narodniks? The Narodniks is the word in Russian for populist, the Populist Party. They were the largest socialist party in Russia, much larger than the Bolsheviks. And they had their roots in the 19th century. And they were an organization that conceived of the bringing of socialism to Russia by bypassing the development of capitalism in Russia and using the peasant commune. Russia was a primarily peasant country. The peasant commune to sort of become the commune, to socialize agriculture, and socialize the countryside, and that they could do it. They only had to overcome the problem of the Tsar, the problem of the monarch. And how can we get rid of the Tsar so we can have peasant socialism, a rural socialism, not a Marxist socialism based on the horrors of capitalism and then upending capitalism and transforming capitalism, but an agricultural socialism where we sort of bypass the evils and horrors of capitalism. Well, we want to reach the peasants, but right now the peasants they're illiterate, and they are also very religious, and they are under the sway of the Tsar. And so they think of the Tsar as their great father. Their oppressors are the landlords and the cops. But the Tsar, far away, you can't see him, but he has He's a messenger from God. The monarchy is based on divine rule. So the peasants, who constitute 90% of the population, they look to the Tsar. So the Narodniks are thinking, how are we going to build peasant socialism when every time we talk to the peasants, they think, well, let's ask the Tsar. I'm vulgarizing it a little bit, but not far. And the populace went to the people, they went to the countryside, they went to the poor peasants, and they said, we're going to build rural socialism. And the poor peasants said, who are you? You're all these middle-class intellectuals and urban people, city folk. Get out of here. And in many cases, they turned them in to the Tsar's gendarmes, to the police. Or sometimes the peasants took them hostage. They're like, we don't want this urban invasion coming into the countryside telling us the Tsar is our enemy and oppressor. So the populace are like, what are we going to do? How are we going to build peasant socialism when the peasants love the Tsar and think the Tsar is an infallible gift from God? Their answer was, kill the Tsar. Yeah. Assassinate the Tsar. And then the peasants will realize he can't be a divine messenger from God because we just killed him. He's very human, just like the rest of us. And then when the peasants were freed from the aura and the spell of Tsarism, then they could begin building peasant socialism because the peasants were so oppressed. So that's the other part of the polemic in what is to be done. It's against the Narodniks. So you have Lenin's polemic against the economists, the people who just deal with bread and butter issue, and the Narodniks who embrace terrorism and they embrace the armed struggle. When they say today terrorism has a kind of a bad name. Well, these people wanted to be called terrorists because they thought terrorism was the way to get rid of the system that terrorized the peasants. They weren't afraid of the language of violence and the employment of violence if it was against the oppressor. They said the armed struggle is righteous if it's against oppression. So if you want to call us terrorists, fine. And we're going to kill the Tsar, and when we kill the Tsar, it'll be a spark that will set off a peasant revolution. So Lenin polemicizes against the Narodniks too. So people are reading this, our comrades, everyone is reading what is to be done because they think it's a charter document that explains why the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks split, why they divided in the Congress the next year, the year after it was published. By the way, how many people here have read or tried to read what is to be done? Okay, a pretty good sample. So you'll agree with me, it's not that easy of a text. It has nothing to do with the split between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks either. So people are reading it for the wrong reason. It's not a charter document of Bolshevism. What is to be done was completely accepted by all factions within the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. The Mensheviks liked it too. What Lenin was trying to do as the central organizer of what he hoped would be a social democratic or communist party was he was explaining how can we do this, how can we do it in Russia where every time we try to organize, we are shut down by the cops. Every time we try to organize, some infiltrator has fingered one of our organizers and all of us are sent to Siberia or to prison. How are we going to reach the working class when there's no free speech? When you don't have the right to distribute a leaflet. If you distribute the leaflet, you go to Siberia. If you tell workers in St. Petersburg that there was a strike in Moscow, that's illegal. You'll go to prison. How do we spread the word of Marxism and social democracy and working class unity when there's no free speech, when there's no bourgeois civil liberties, when we don't have the right to protest or speak or assemble? How are we going to do that? Lenin is devising a plan to build a party similar to the social democratic mass Marxist parties that existed in Europe, where workers did have free speech rights. But in Russia, there was no free speech, so they had to build an underground party based on underground cadre made up of professional revolutionaries, another set of words that are profoundly misunderstood by people, including people who think they're Leninists. They think professional revolutionaries mean, you mean I'm a professional revolutionary, that means I'm dedicating my life 100% to building the party and making the revolution. Well, that's true. But that's not actually what Lenin meant by being a professional revolutionary, although that could be a very good and is one acceptable definition of being a professional revolutionary. What he meant is, how do you have a branch meeting and not have everybody get arrested afterwards? How do you bring workers together under conditions of a police state where there are no civil liberties and no freedoms? How do you bring them together where we're not completely disassembled, broken up, and sent to Siberia or prison almost immediately? Professional means, how do you become an effective, skilled organizer in an underground movement, in an underground party? So Lenin said, well, we have to build a national newspaper. We have to build a national newspaper. For those of you who have read What Is to Be Done, people, communists all around said, we got to build a paper because Lenin said, in What Is to Be Done, you got to build a newspaper. Yeah, the newspaper. And then, in the last 20 years with social media, people say, well, can we do other things too? Not just have a hard copy newspaper? Lenin said we have to build a national newspaper and give the party line. Well, Lenin's thesis of a national newspaper wasn't universally applicable to all movements and all parties. This is another, for those of you who have read What Is to Be Done and talked about it, this is a complete misunderstanding. The German Social Democratic Party, which Lenin considered to be the model Social Democratic Party, had hundreds of newspapers and magazines and many, many other publications and schools. They had sports teams, they had choirs, they built a society within a society, a communist society within German capitalist society. That was the model that all the socialists at the time that Lenin wrote What Is to Be Done, they all looked to Germany. By 1910, the German Reichstag, the parliament, 1/3 of the members were members of the Socialist Party. They were the largest party. Once workers got the right to vote, they were voting for socialists. And Lenin was making the argument that we want to be like them. We want to have that kind of influence. We want to build that kind of party. But we can't because we don't have free speech rights. We can't even have a meeting. We can't distribute a leaflet. So what was the point of having a national newspaper? Was it to unify all of the different autonomous groups that couldn't talk to each other? Yes. So it was to build the party by unifying different socialist groups that at that moment had no right to speak to each other. Why did it have to be underground? Because otherwise it would be just suppressed. So yes, it was to unify the party, to bring the different collectives, the different sort of autonomous groups that were in line with the party but couldn't connect. So that was one. It was also to raise money because, people really sold the paper. They really sold it. They raised a lot of money. They sent the money. They kept the money for local organizing, but they also sent it back to the headquarters. But Lenin's idea of a national newspaper with underground reporters and underground agents distributing the paper wasn't even mainly about the party line, even though it was. What was it really for? Lenin was preparing for an armed struggle. He was preparing for an armed struggle to topple the monarchy. He was preparing for armed struggle against the Tsar. And by establishing the secret society or organization that distributed the newspaper, you were in touch with the reliable agents who you knew would be the cadres, the professional revolutionaries who weren't going to get caught, the ones who could make contact with the masses, who could keep their pulse on the mood of the masses in different places. When you really read What Is to Be Done and sort of really get into it, what Lenin's really talking about is creating an apparatus for armed struggle masquerading as a newspaper distribution outlet or system. And he says it explicitly. So Lenin is trying to creatively build a party like the European parties in conditions where there's no civil rights, civil liberties. They have to do it in an underground way. But there's this big difference between Lenin and Lenin's orientation and the orientation of the German Social Democratic Party. Big difference. Lenin considers them the model. He wants to be like them. He wants to have that kind of influence in society. What's the principal difference between the German Social Democratic Party, which has 1/3 of the seats in the Reichstag, and Lenin's version of that party in Russia? In Germany, the leadership of the party thought if they could keep winning more and more and more seats in the parliament, that ultimately they would be the government and they would be able to control the state. And with the control of the government and the state apparatus, they would be able to legislate socialism in step by step by step. In other words, that they could carry out the peaceful transition from capitalism to socialism because they would be a government elected by the majority. By the way, Salvador Allende had essentially the same concept when he was elected president of Chile in 1970. And Allende, as a Marxist, knew all of these other lessons, but he felt, and they felt, the party, the Communist Party and the Left Socialist Party that created that front, felt that if they could become the government in Chile, they could step by step legislate in socialism and try to prevent the counter-revolution. They did not. They did not succeed. And on September 11th, 1973, the Chilean military, orchestrated by the CIA, carried out the counter-revolutionary coup d'etat that took the communists out of power, took the socialists out of power, and slaughtered 30,000 Chilean activists almost immediately. Lenin's conception was you're building a party to carry out an armed struggle. And the other part of what people don't understand about Lenin's writings and what is to be done is his polemic against the Narodniks, against the populists, against the terrorists, was not a renunciation of either terror or violence or armed struggle. As a matter of fact, he says in What is to be Done, parts that are not really widely read, these people are our heroes. He said, we're going to create a party in Russia, and he mentions it'll produce individuals like August Bebel, who is the leader of the German Social Democratic Party, a carpenter, a worker who became the leader of the party because of his oratorical and literary skills. He's a worker. A lot of the leaders of the German Social Democratic Party were workers who came from the ranks of the working class. They weren't just petty bourgeois intellectuals. Not that there weren't a small army of them as well. But it was workers who had ascended because of the development of their skills through the party. He says, we'll produce people like Bebel, and we'll produce a guy's name who I can't pronounce his Russian name, again, one of the problems with What is to be Done, who is one of the great martyrs of the Narodniks. He said, we'll produce if we do a party that works properly, we can train people who can do both, meaning we're going to train workers to become leaders, to become the ruling class of society by virtue of having political education and organizational education. The workers can become the government. They can become the leaders of the party. They can run society. They make society run. They can run society. We're going to have those workers. But we're also going to have individuals who are willing to die and who don't fear death, who are ready to die for the cause of the people, ready to die for the revolution. And that was the spirit of Narodnism. So what is to be done? Lenin is shedding the strategy of Narodnism, of terrorism, because he said it's ineffective to have small groups engage in terrorism. But Lenin's core thesis is there's nothing wrong with a few guns that a few 100,000 guns won't fix. right? In other words, that if you have an organized urban proletariat that becomes conscious of its mission to carry out revolution, if it does that, then you don't have this little vanguard like the populists who try to change society and make revolution without the masses. The whole thesis of social democracy and Marxism and Leninism, and this is the core of Leninism, is to merge socialism with the existing movement of the people, the existing workers' movement, to bring socialism to the workers' movement, educate the workers in the knowledge of Marxism so that the workers become the real leadership of the movement and then become, by virtue of having led the movement, the new ruling class in society. That they remake society based on the interests of the collective, because the working class doesn't have individual private property owning interests. Workers don't, if workers are working, if you have 10,000 workers in a factory, what's the solution if you're being oppressed by your capitalists? It's not to divide the factory into 10,000 small pieces. It's to collectivize the factory, seize the factory, put it under workers' control. And the same with all the other enterprises. That's the whole conception of Marxism. And Lenin's idea of the party is that the party can never succeed without the masses, because the party, the vanguard, doesn't really make revolution. The masses of people make revolution. What's wrong with the populist notion was vanguardism without a base. Vanguardism without a class or social base capable of carrying out the revolution. Because the populist, the small vanguard, will always ultimately be isolated, always be atomized, ultimately always defeated. Everything about Lenin's teachings is about how to make revolution. And he rejects populism, small group terrorism, and like Marx and like the Social Democrats, is imbued with the idea that the masses of people make history. There's another misunderstanding promoted by the bourgeoisie about what is to be done. Really bad misinterpretation. What the bourgeoisie says is that Lenin was building a vanguard party of elitist intellectuals who are going to tell the workers what to think and how to think. That the party substituted itself for the masses, that the party was a group of elite. This is completely false. Lenin, and if you read Lenin carefully, all 46 volumes, in fact, consistently, you'll see that what Lenin does is he premises everything on a complete, unyielding faith in the working class. Other authors call this the heroic scenario of Lenin, like Lars T. Lee. In other words, that Lenin is completely imbued with the idea that the masses, the people who have nothing, who don't own property, who are oppressed, who are exploited, who toil, that they are not simply victims of capitalism, they can be its gravediggers, that they can destroy capitalism, and by so doing they can recreate and reorganize society. That's the Marxist notion. It's the concept that the masses actually make history, but the masses need leadership and organization in order to win. Why? Not because the masses are not smart enough, but because their enemy is highly centralized. You go out and do a demonstration here in New York City, the New York City Police Department is a highly centralized organization. It's bigger than most countries' armies. It's got communication, it's got mobility, it's completely centralized. If you're in the process of revolution and your enemy is completely centralized, the working class also needs to be centralized. Not because there's a fetish about centralization and not because people discount the importance of the masses, but in order to defeat the enemy in combat, you need an organization capable of combat. That's what the purpose of a centralist organization is. It's for combat. I know all the people who are listening to this are saying, are you advocating armed struggle in the United States? And, you're already under such scrutiny. Of course not. I'm teaching a history lesson here. We're borrowing a page of history to talk about what Lenin's conception of revolution is and how it happens. Anyway, my point being, we have to really get into Lenin's head to understand these words. Don't take the polemic against the economists as the gospel. Some people say, well, that shows you shouldn't be dealing with wages and benefits because he had this polemic against the economists. But if you're going to be a mass workers' party, how do you not talk to the workers about their wages and benefits and whether they're unemployed and whether they can pay rent? These are the things that actually matter to people every day. And at the same time, if you limit your struggle simply to bread and butter demands, as soon as the workers get wages, prices will go up the next year and all those wage gains are gone. The only way to secure the reforms that Leninists and Marxists seek and want to embrace and fight for is to actually get rid of the problem in the first place. The problem in the first place is the capitalist system. I mean, you look at what's going on in the world today where they just cut off COVID relief funds for child care centers, and now 70,000 kids are going to lose child care. 70,000 child care centers are going to go out of business. 3.2 million kids are going to lose, and that's 3.2 million families. That's a policy choice by the capitalists. Increasing childhood poverty and making kids destitute isn't natural, it's not necessary, it's a policy choice. And so if you want to fight for reform, some people say, well, get the Democrats because maybe we'll get a little bit more, a little bit. Well, they'll take it back. They're taking it back now. You need revolution if you want to even embrace and maintain the reforms that have been won. Even look at Roe v. Wade. I mean, really? Like the majority, certainly the majority of women and really the majority of the population completely affirms the right of women to control their own bodies. But it's been taken away. I mean, that's reason enough to have a revolution. There's many, many reasons. You can make thousands. But in order to make revolution, the masses of people have to be in a revolutionary mood. They have to be ready for revolution. They have to have gone through a series of experiences where they really finally realize the Democrats are not an option. They have to consider that there's organizations that are serious, that aren't, just full of hot air and militant rhetoric, but actually know how to function and organize. And they also have to see the enemy. If the ruling class looks completely united, that's a scary enterprise for most people. You got 980,000 uniformed police officers in the United States. If they were under one employer, that would be the single biggest employer in America, would be uniformed cops. You have 2.2 million people in the military. Like, how are you going to have a revolution in a country like this? The threat of the state is real. So all these other conditions have to exist for revolution, but one of them is that there has to be a sharp division within the ruling class, a division so sharp that the normal functioning of the repressive apparatus has been paralyzed. And also, as we could see during the Vietnam War, when hundreds of thousands of U.S. soldiers decided they'd rather kill their officers than go be sent to the next battle in a war they knew couldn't be won, a war they didn't understand, a war they knew was completely racist. When the soldiers and the rank and file in the military started to turn against the brass and think of them as their enemy, these are the necessary set of circumstances, multiple circumstances taking place simultaneously that make revolution possible. But to have revolution, Lenin's argument, Marx's argument, and the argument of both the Second and the Third International is you have to have an organization. And you can call yourself a professional revolutionary in any way you want to define it. When you're among your friends, you can say whatever you are. You're like, I'm this, I'm that, I'm whatever. But how do you become a professional at anything? That's training, right? That's education. That's practice. That's experience. I can't say today, I'm a professional biologist. That's not how it works. So the organization that Lenin's building is a school. It's a school for activists. It's a school for organizers. It's a school for cadres. And it's not just like when the movement's at its height, like the last 7 weeks, we've been in the streets in the hundreds of thousands, like happened in the summer of 2020 after the killing of George Floyd. But this movement, like all movements, will subside. And a whole bunch of people will say, what was it for? And it was so great, but it's gone now. Well, all mass movements ebb and flow. They go up and down. How do you not start from scratch each time the movement starts over? You have to have an organization. The organization is the receptacle, it's the vessel, it's the memory. It's the ability to collectivize and generalize from the experience of what just happened. The party, according to Marx and Lenin, is the class memory for the generation and succeeding generations, so we're not starting from scratch. Marxist theory is not people think of Marxist theory as some intellectualized sort of head in the clouds, philosophical discourse with lots of academic words that nobody understands. That's not what it is. Marxist theory is nothing other than the generalization of the class struggle. The generalization of the class struggle. And Lenin, and this is Lenin's great contribution, in his generalizing of the class struggle, he revived the parts of Marxism that the European social democratic movements had forgotten. What did they forget? They didn't forget about the part you have to win over the masses, you have to educate the people, you have to build a strong organization, that you have to have influence in the unions, that you should try to have influence in the parliament. All of that is true. But what is it that they forgot? They forgot that ultimately it would take revolution in order to achieve socialism. And this became, they didn't forget it. It was a learned forgetfulness. A learned forgetfulness. Because if you have a third of the members of parliament and you're suddenly engaged in revolution or something very profoundly unpopular, all the members in parliament are going to be sent to jail or killed. All of your newspapers, your hundreds of periodicals will be shut down. You can't come to meetings. You can't collect dues. Everything shatters. And that's precisely what happened on August 4th, 1914, when World War I started. World War I was a war unlike any other war in human history. 20 million people died in 4 years. The different belligerents, when they started World War I, they thought it would be over in a couple of weeks. They didn't think this was going to be a long war. Very big miscalculation. At the end of the war, the Russian dynasty was gone from revolution. The German monarchy gone from revolution. The Austro-Hungarian dynasty, the Habsburg, gone. The Ottoman Empire, gone. The four of the major dynastic rules ended as a consequence of a war that killed 20 million people and shattered the existing capitalist imperialist system. Well, 2 years before that war started, Lenin and the socialists, the Bolsheviks, Kautsky, from the leaders of the German Socialist Party, they met together in Basel, Switzerland, and they thought, war is coming. We can see it coming because there had already been wars in 1912 and 1913 in the Balkans. Here's what they said at the Basel Manifesto, the Social Democratic Manifesto, something that was very dear and important to Lenin, and Lenin actually helped write some of these resolutions for the Social Democrats. And here's what it says. It's 2 short paragraphs. If a war threatens to break out, it is the duty of the working classes and their parliamentary representatives in the countries involved, supported by the coordinating activity of the International Socialist Bureau, the Second International, to exert every effort to prevent the outbreak of war, try to stop it before it starts, by means that they consider most effective, whatever those might be, including parliamentary votes, which naturally vary according to the sharpening of the class struggle and the sharpening of the general political situation. So if war is coming, it's our duty, all of the workers, all the communists are in this international, all the socialists. This is our duty. Second paragraph, listen to these words carefully. In case war should break out anyway, it is their duty to intervene in favor of its speedy termination, end the war quickly, and with all of their powers to utilize the economic and political crisis created by the war to arouse the people and thereby to hasten the downfall of capitalist class rule. They're saying to the socialists, if you can't stop the war, try to make a revolution because of the war. In other words, don't become a patriot. Don't become a socialist patriot, social patriot. Become a revolutionary. Be a revolutionary. And they all swore that this was their pledge, the Basel Manifesto. So if you're taking notes, Basel Manifesto, 1912, very important document. 2 years later, the war breaks out, August 4th, 1914. And Lenin is in Europe in exile, his second exile, and he reads in the paper that all of the members of the German Social Democratic Party in the Reichstag, the parliament, voted to support the war. They voted to support sending money for the war. And Lenin at first thought it was a trick. He said, he literally thought it was a trick. He wrote to his comrades, he said, this is a trick. Don't worry, this is a trick. There's no possible way the German party would have supported the war because we were all just in Basel in Switzerland and we did this manifesto. And it turns out not only did they support the war, every one of them supported the war. Every one of them. A few months later, one of them, Karl Liebknecht, voted against the war. So 1 out of 330. Every one of them. So, you know that slogan on the Communist Manifesto and on the banners of the Russian Social Democratic Party and the German Social Democratic Party? Workers of the world unite. We have nothing to lose but our chains. Workers have no nation. We're a class of the exploited and the oppressed. If I'm French, I have more in common with my German worker, a comrade, than I do with my own French boss. My boss is my enemy, not the German worker. I won't be tricked and fooled and sent to slaughter my co-workers from other countries. And as soon as the war started, everything was gone. Every party, almost every party, supported the war. And the Bolsheviks were the only party in Russia that didn't support the war. And Lenin insisted that not only should they take this formulation, that we should take advantage of the war to make revolution, he actually said the slogan of the party must be, we favor the defeat of our own government rather than its victory in the war. That's called revolutionary defeatism. Talk about a radical position at the time of war. Can you imagine? This is when Germans and Russians were already killing each other. And then you say, I actually favor the defeat of my government. But he said to the German workers, you guys say the same thing. Nobody should support anybody's victory. So if we all support revolutionary defeatism, we say to the workers across the battlefield, you are our brother, you are our sister, you are our comrade. We're not going to shoot each other. Let's fraternize. Let's be together. I'd rather be with you and have my bourgeoisie lose the war. And for Lenin, he also recognized that if the Tsarist government is defeated in the war, this will be the revolution. Because war is one of the biggest triggers to revolution. There was the 1917 revolution happened, but before that there was the 1905 revolution, which happened because Russia lost a war with Japan in 1904. So all of the socialists capitulated. Some of the American socialists did not, but the U.S. wasn't yet in the war. The U.S. doesn't come into the war until 1918. Eugene Debs spoke out against the war. What happened to him? Sentenced to 10 years at hard labor at age 66 because he made a speech against the war. In the case of the Russian representatives in the parliament, their Duma, they were all put on trial facing the death penalty. And at the trial, Lenin complained that some of them tried to prevent their execution by softening the position. He said he was disappointed in them. Those are very high standards. But Lenin was serious. Like, the thing about Lenin's politics is everything in all of the seeming extremity of Lenin's position, he's presenting things in such extreme ways, like revolutionary defeatism. It's not just take advantage of the war to make revolution, but let's favor the defeat of our own government. He always clarified the issue by making it so, in a way, his extremity made it so clear that there couldn't be some wobbling. No, there was a left wing of the socialists called the Zimmerwald left that met in Zimmerwald, a town in Switzerland. They started to band together in 1916, and there was about, 40 of them who met together. Lenin's group only had 8 votes out of the 40, and these were the left-wing socialists who were against the war because they were like, revolutionary defeatism? That's not, you can't say that. We'll be destroyed. And Lenin was like, no, that's our position. He voted for the overall manifesto, even though it didn't include revolutionary defeatism, because he said it's a step forward because they were such a tiny minority. But Leninism and Lenin's politics don't really exist as an international phenomena until 1914. Between 1903 and 1914, Bolshevism and Lenin and Leninism is a purely Russian phenomena. It's only World War I and the outbreak of World War I and the capitulation of the Social Democrats, which was considered to be the single biggest defeat of the working class movement in the history of the working class, was this capitulation. That's when Lenin becomes an international figure. And 3 years later, the Russian Revolution does happen. They have taken advantage of the situation, as Lenin insisted that they do. And then that was the February Revolution against the Tsar. And Lenin comes back from exile and he says, well, let's have a second revolution because this revolution they're not going to get out of the war. And people are like, we're going to have another revolution? We just overthrew a 300-year-long dynasty, the Romanovs. And now you come back a month later and say, time for the second revolution. And Lenin was treated as basically somebody who had gone crazy. Somebody who was completely out of touch. There was a euphoria. Whenever there's a revolution, it's the oppressed are celebrating. Matter of fact, one of the biggest problems in the Russian Revolution, both in February and October, was the amount of drunkenness. Everybody who could loot a wine cellar did. There was massive inebriation going on because people were partying. They were like, the witch is dead. The Tsar is dead. Wasn't quite dead, but gone. So there's all this celebration, and Lenin comes back and says, yeah, now we have to have a second revolution because this government won't get us out of the war. But he came back and said, we can't really have the revolution now because everybody's in such a state of euphoria. But we will patiently and persistently explain to the masses why this new government, which you think is so great, like a Bernie Sanders type government, let's just to give a context. It would be like Bernie Sanders became president. Everybody's like, my God, Bernie Sanders is president. And then you find out like 2 weeks later, yeah, he's still giving money to Israel. And, you're like a whole bunch of people would say, well, still it's Bernie. It's not Biden. It's not Trump. Let's stick with it. And Lenin was like, no, we're going to have a second revolution. And it's going to happen because these guys, this ruling class, won't leave the war. And they couldn't leave the war. They couldn't leave the war because the new provisional government, which was a bourgeois but radical and kind of revolutionary government, was still tied to its alliances with France, Britain, and the United States. And Britain, France, and the United States said, if you end the war, if Russia leaves the war, the Germans won't have to fight on the Eastern Front. They can devote all of their forces towards us. So you Russians, we know you just lost 3 million people. We know your army is in a state of complete mutiny. We know the farmers, the peasants who make up most of the army don't want to fight, won't fight, are going back to their farms. Their families are starving to death. We know all that, but stay in the war because we need you to have an Eastern Front. And over the next 8 months, everything changes. And instead of this euphoria for the revolutionary government, the provisional government, Lenin turns out to be right. And they can make revolution, but you needed a party. How do you carry out an insurrection? How do you carry out the art of warfare at the moment of revolution when all of those conditions that I described before, those multiple cascading crises of capitalism and changes in consciousness coincide? Rare moments. Think about how many revolutions have there been in history? Not many. It's rare. All of these factors have to come together, but you need a leadership to do it. You needed Mao and the Communist Party in China to do it. You needed Fidel in Cuba to do it. You need a leadership that's tested, that's trained, that knows how to act, that's bold and audacious on one hand, but also knows how to retreat if necessary, like an experienced group of professional revolutionaries. And the Bolsheviks could make the second revolution because they had oriented towards revolutionary defeatism, complete implacable hostility towards their own bourgeoisie, taking advantage of the revolution, and going back to where I started, that Lenin always, even as he brought the social democratic Marxist conception of mass revolution, he never abandoned the Narodnik idea of armed struggle. So he merges these things together. He's trained his party to do it. Was the party a monolith? Not by any means. Lots of struggles, lots of factional fights. We'll discuss that at another time. But basically, they have the instrument so that when the masses are ready for revolution against the provisional government, they did it. Why are we having this class, everybody? Because they made that revolution. Without that revolution, we wouldn't be talking about Lenin. Name other leaders of communist parties, especially in Europe, that didn't take power. Great, intellectual, heroic, interesting, whatever adjective you want to use, figure. Name them, shout them out. There's not many. Maybe somebody will yell Gramsci because there was a revival of Gramsci. Maybe people were, not many people. We know about Lenin because the revolution happened. That's why we study. People think of what is to be done, or imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, or state and revolution, or the proletarian revolution, and the renegade Kautsky. All these books that we read them because they won. And by winning, there was a transformation of socialism. Now, I name the Marxist Leninists who we know of in the world today. What are the Italian Marxist Leninists? Or the French? Or the Germans? No, we don't know their names. We know Mao Zedong, Kim Il-sung, Ho Chi Minh, Fidel Castro. Lenin and the Russian Revolution transformed socialism because it goes south and east. It leaves Europe. Not completely, but it mainly leaves Europe because the center of revolutionary gravity is going east and south. It's going to what we call now the global south, the colonized and semi-colonized parts of the world. Lenin, in his orientation towards armed struggle, towards revolution, implacable hostility towards imperialism, and of course his position, unlike some of the other social democrats, of complete 100% support for the armed uprising of the colonized people, which Russia said, we will help you. In China, we will help you. In India, in Indonesia, in Palestine. There's some other Marxist-Leninists I didn't mention. George Habash from the party, the Popular Front for the Liberation. Marxism becomes non-European in terms of the center of its revolutionary gravity because of the Russian Revolution, because of Lenin's orientation, because of revolution, because of armed struggle, because of the colonial question, and because of the creation of a new socialist instrument called the Third International replaces the Second International. That all happens after the Russian Revolution. Could not have happened without the Russian Revolution. So the Russian Revolution has to feed a starving population. They have to defend the country from 14 imperialist invading armies. And they also take on the task of reorganizing the socialist movement. Big, amazing tasks. Too many for one country, one party to handle, and it was too much. But they did it because Lenin's heroic scenario finally is vindicated in the revolution. And now his goal is to make that spread all over the world. His last words before Lenin dies, I'm going to try to quickly find this, if I can. Anyway, I can't find it. I'm going to paraphrase it. He says his last words, literally his last words in his writings, better, fewer, but better. They're worried. We're going to cover this more in the next two classes. He's worried because the revolution's not happening in Europe. They feel surrounded by imperialist enemies. He says, ultimately, the fate of our revolution, whether we survive or don't survive, it will depend on the people of China. It will depend on the people of India. It will depend on the people of the colonized world. Those are his last words, which I wish I could find right now, but I can't. Maybe when we do the Q&A, I'll find them. Amazing visionary that he could say literally on his political deathbed, his last words, if the revolution doesn't happen in Europe, that'll be terrible. We'll be isolated. We have to do everything we can to hold out. But ultimately, his confidence is that the center of revolutionary gravity is moving east and south. And he says that's where the majority of the people of the globe live. Their uprising, which he is now completely envisioning as part of an alliance with the Soviet Union, that will be the way the socialist project in Soviet Russia will succeed, if it could succeed. So I'm going to end there and open it. I have like 15 slides that I didn't use a single one of them. They're going to be so great next time. I was trying to use a PowerPoint for the very first time, and obviously didn't succeed with that one. But I want to thank all of you for coming, and we do have time for Q&A.
Thank you so much, Brian. So what we'll do is, if you can raise your hand if you have a question, we'll go around to as many as we can. And if you're online, please put your question in the YouTube chat, and we will also get as many questions as we can.
How long should the questions and Great, okay. But not all at once. Somebody has to break the ice.
Okay. Hi, I'm Maya. I have a question about Lenin and the revolution in the United Front. So uniting with other organizations that were maybe more reactionary at the time to overthrow the Tsar. And also how that would look today in revolution. Can you collaborate with other organizations that are more reactionary, even though you're kind of fighting for the same thing but in different ways? So I guess that was kind of not a fully formed question, but I don't know.
It's an important, good question. Should we do one by one and do? Let me do that one. Yeah. So the question is, should we repeat the question, Leanne? Yeah. Go ahead. So the question is, what about united fronts with organizations that are less revolutionary, or in some cases even partly reactionary, for a common objective? What's the Leninist position? Am I saying it correct? Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
So yes, Lenin was not a sectarian at all. All of Lenin's polemics are so exaggerated. His style is so exaggerated. Like if he's fighting with you, he said, Brian, you idiot, you imbecile, you blah, like that's how he starts. And so every polemic has this exaggerated sort of element because he really wants to convince the reader that the person he's fighting against has something really wrong with them. But in life, in reality, Lenin was very not sectarian and very oriented towards the United Front, as long as it didn't violate the core principles of Bolshevism. And that really is the hallmark of Lenin. Lenin had this capacity for extreme, sort of hardcore, principled steadfastness to principle, and also suppleness and flexibility in tactics. And you can't really think about Leninist tactics without that. The reading I sent around, or we sent around before, the pre-reading was from Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder. He's talking about the need to work in unions, and even with unions with reactionary leaderships, because that's where the workers are. And you can't, you have to work artfully. You can't just go in and blow the thing up. I mean, I don't mean literally, but I mean blow it up in terms of your language, your words, your orientation. You have to work within a particular environment. In 1905, when the revolution is happening, and he's just spent 3 years writing those terrible, like really hard-hitting polemics against the Mensheviks, he's excited because a big part of the Mensheviks are coming back into the fold for the armed struggle against the Tsar. That was 1905, in December 1905. So a big part of the Menshevik organization is coming. And then you can read in his writings, he was like, well, the rank and file they don't understand why there's a Mensheviks and a Bolsheviks. Like, why aren't we all together? And this is at a moment of revolution. And he was like, he can't fully explain it at that moment because they're all at the barricades together, fighting together. So in that moment, Lenin is actually welcoming the people he's just spent the last 3 years attacking. He's welcoming because in the street, in the fight, they're on the same side. And if you look at Lenin's position, this is a remarkable thing about Lenin's personality, not just his political orientation. Lenin is someone who is completely impersonal, in the best sense of the word, towards other people in politics. The people he fights with over and over and over again, who he calls all those terrible names, if they come and join him, he's like, no grudge, no beef, that's over. That's not, we're all about what's happening right now. So you see at times like his orientation towards Trotsky, where Trotsky was this, really anti-Bolshevik force from 1904 to 1917, but he agrees with Lenin that there should be a second revolution after February. He comes back, and Lenin, some of the Bolsheviks just hated Trotsky so much, but Lenin was like, no, bring them in, and they actually had very high positions within the party. When Kamenev and Zinoviev, two other close comrades of his, not only opposed the insurrection in October 1917, but they were so opposed to it that they revealed the plans for the insurrection in a non-party press. And Lenin said, expel these strikebreakers. These guys, I want to say it clearly, expel them because they were my best friends. They were his best friends for years in exile. He said, no, expel them because they were my friends, I want everybody to know they should be expelled. Because what they did is like by opposing the insurrection, and their opposition was so big that they actually exposed it in a non-party press, they should be expelled. And then everybody else on the Central Committee was like, they're not going to expel them. And like a year later, Zinoviev's the head of the Third International. Because Lenin was like, once the thing was done, it was done. Once the battle was fought, there wasn't a grudge, there wasn't a beef. So all of the people he's in fights with, he fights them like tooth and nail, and then he embraces them as soon as they come over. The economist, the leader of the economists who is polemicized so much against in What Is to Be Done, Martyanov, not Martov, who was the leader of the Mensheviks, but another guy named Martyanov, another reason why it's hard to read What Is to Be Done. He joins the Bolsheviks after the revolution and becomes a high official in the Bolshevik party and in the Soviet government. Lenin was, he was impersonal in that sense. He didn't, If people were for the revolution, doing the right thing, he was for them no matter what the earlier fight was. That's an important sort of characteristic feature. Because, unfortunately, we live in a social media world where people actually go out of their way to fight with each other and pick fights and exaggerate fights, like for no good reason, actually. And it makes the coming together even harder later, when in fact almost all the people who are fighting in these weird, ridiculous online beefs should be actually on the same side. In terms of the United Front, that's an example. When the Mensheviks wanted to have an armed struggle, were for the armed struggle, he was for it. Plekhanov, who he denounces later, Plekhanov says they shouldn't have picked up weapons. Now, Lenin was completely for the armed insurrection in 1905. He demanded it, he organized it, and it was a complete flop. Everybody gets killed in the first revolution. And Lenin said, well, it was kind of good practice. It imbues the party with the spirit of struggle. He's not down at all by the fact that they've been defeated. And Plekhanov denounces the picking up the gun. Plekhanov said, you see how badly we lost? That shows we shouldn't have done this. And Lenin denounces him as a counter-revolutionary. 4 years later, Plekhanov starts to come back into Lenin's position on something. He says, oh, it's great, Plekhanov is supporting our position. There was none of this kind of infantile sectarianism that is so associated with parts of the Marxist, communist, or Leninist movement. That was a long answer to a great but short question. I apologize for such a long answer.
Yes, okay. Good evening, comrades and friends. Yes, my name is Linda. I'm from a domestic workers organization in New York. So I came from the Philippines. I was professional, revolutionary in the Philippines, if you may call me. I was a full-time, activist. I joined the underground in the Philippines. So I can relate to, the important points that Brian was talking about. Like, if we want real change, it could come only through revolution. And if we want to make revolution, we have to connect and to educate and to organize the most oppressed, the vast masses of the people. So in the Philippines, that's 70% farmers, 20% workers, the workers that we define, and the 10% will be a mix of the petty bourgeoisie and the national bourgeoisie at that time. Now, I am here now in America, right? So I am one of the founders of our organization, yes, and we're trying to apply sincerely, the most important lessons that we got from effecting true change, whatever that looks like in America here. So one thing that I learned there is know your enemies and know your friends. And you can do that only through class analysis. So here, I thought that, the most oppressed among the Filipinos here are the migrant workers, the domestic workers. We're abused. I was a domestic worker for 18 years. I know how to be abused, right? Yes, and there are trafficked workers, the most abused. Yeah. So we focused on organizing them. Yeah, we spent a lot of resources, poured our hearts out, our brains out, We now, so many of them got the trafficking visas, reunited their families on U.S. soil. And guess what? After uniting their families here, most of them left the organization. So we know that, giving services, will not revolutionize the masses. But it's the only way you can get connected to them. So here, doing services is a lot of work and a lot of resources, a lot of time. So I could easily say that the nonprofit work here is a trap. It is a trap for those who sincerely want change and don't know what to do. You know, the easy task is to help, you know, who are needy, who are poor, you know, and it's a never-ending task. That's what we did. While guided with the idea that no, we will just be moving in circles if this is what we do. So we have to do political education. That's what we're trying to do. That's why I'm here, you know, with some of my friends in the organization. But going back to my question is about class analysis here, because domestic workers here are actually not the most oppressed from the country of origin. They're mostly lower middle class, you know, college graduates who did not get the opportunity back home, you know, to be, you know, to move upward and support the family. No. So here, they're like that. You know, I don't know who are the most oppressed Filipinos here, but we still do the same, you know, give services, try to, you know, politicalize them and join the wider movement and just hoping for the best. Comrades, thank you.
No, we'll take another question.
Can I see the other hands?
First of all, let me preface that I don't know much about, I haven't read much socialism, communism. So I was wondering what is Bolshevism and Menshevism, and how big was the Central Committee, and how did they settle differences between the leaders and elites and the non-elites, and how people got elected into the Central Committee. How big was the Central Committee?
This would actually give me a chance to use one of my slides. Who would have thought? No, I want to, what are the Mensheviks and Bolsheviks? Because I did sort of a broad survey. I glossed over like many things. Bolshevik means majority, and Menshevik means minority. So at the Congress, the Second Congress in 1903, where they split into two wings, Lenin was the majority by one vote. And for the rest of the time, the next 20 years, they were called the majority. And his majority ended about 3 days after the Congress because the people who voted with them changed their mind. And they were like, no, we don't agree with you. And so the Mensheviks were actually, the minority was actually the majority. Weird, right? But these names, the labels stuck. So let's put up a slide of Axelrod, Pavel Axelrod, Zazulich, and well, anyway, I'm so happy we can use our slides for a moment. But this is Georgy Plekhanov. He was the one who brought Marxism to Russia. He translated Marx's works into Russian. Vera Zazulich. These were the leaders of the Mensheviks, the Menshevik faction, and that's Pavel Axelrod. They were the first Marxists in Russia, and they were with Lenin until the Second Congress, and then they split, basically. So who are they? Plekhanov is the person who translates Marx into Russian, bringing social democracy. Vera Zazulich, very interesting, Menshevik. She was a young woman in 1879, one of the leaders of the popular will, the Narodniks. They were all Narodniks, by the way. They were all populists. This guy comes into prison, and the colonel, who's the judge, says to the peasant, "Take your cap off." And the guy says, "No, I don't want to take my cap off." And they whipped him. They flogged him in the courtroom So Vera shot him, shot the colonel. She carried out, they were a terrorist organization. So it was like, you're going to whip peasants who don't take their cap off? We're going to shoot you. And Pavel Axelrod was also one of the leaders of the populist movement. And they all gave up populism and became Marxists. So these are the founders of Russian Marxism. So at the Congress, a lot of people think that the split between the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks was about different things. Some people think, well, they had a disagreement about what does it mean to be a member. If you're a member of the party, the Leninist conception is, if you're a member of the party, you can't be like the history professor who just shows up once in a while and makes a speech. You have to actually be involved in party work. You have to do work. You have to be like everybody else. You can't be like, just show up because you happen to be privileged and know how to speak well. And the Mensheviks were like, no, anybody who generally sympathizes with the party, who's for the party, we don't want to cut these people off. We want to recruit them. We don't want to alienate like those forces. We want to include them. And so Lenin and Martov and these guys had a big fight over that. And a lot of people think that's why they split. What does it mean to be a member of a democratic centralist party? That's not why this split happened. That was a minor dispute. Both sides, by the way, favored democratic centralism. Lenin wanted to replace Vera Zasulich and Axelrod as the editors of the party newspaper, Iskra, and have a 3-person editorial board. This was creating this national new party paper, which was kind of an underground armed preparation thing. He didn't think they were going to be capable of doing it. They were older. They came from a different world. He wanted a new, younger group. So he proposed Plekhanov, Martov, who became the leader of the Mensheviks, and himself to be the editorial board. And after the Congress, everybody said, how could you kick out Vera? She's such a hero. She did shoot the colonel. And she, by the way, she escaped from prison and got away. That's how that all happened. She was like, everybody considered her a big hero in Russia. And Axelrod, it was like mean on Lenin's part to push these old people out of the way. And when Lenin said, no, the party Congress decided this by a vote of 1. We were the Bolsheviks, we were the majority, but a democratic centralist party, the Congress decision is final. This is, if you don't have that, if you have informal leadership where after the fact the old heads get together and say, nah, we didn't like that decision. He said it wasn't really about even this decision, it's about what's the process. Democratic centralism means the Congress is the highest body of the party. When it votes, its votes matter. Its vote matters. And that was what the split was about. And when they refused to do it, Lenin resigned. He was no longer the leader of any party. He was no longer the editor of Iskra. He was kind of in the wilderness. And Rosa Luxemburg and Trotsky carried out a character assassination campaign because they were friends with these guys. That's what caused the split. But that's not important. None of that is important. Because what really, not a small detail, a big thing that I left out of my presentation, and since there weren't a lot of other questions, I'm going to just take the time to do it. And I think this, in a way, is the most important thing, which I left out, is that the real difference between the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks was not about whether there was going to be a Russian revolution or that it was even going to be an armed struggle. Both sides pretty much knew to get rid of a 300-year-long dynasty, it would probably include some amount of violence and force. The question was, what class was going to lead the revolution? The Mensheviks thought this is going to be the bourgeois democratic or bourgeois national revolution against feudalism, semi-feudalism, czarism. It's going to be like the French Revolution in 1789. This is the era where the bourgeoisie takes over. They build capitalism, we build a proletarian party, and then we make the revolution. So they had the stages theory of revolution. The stage was the bourgeois democratic stage. The bourgeois democratic elements would lead the struggle. And so the Mensheviks always deferred to the liberals. And we see this in our own movement. There's the difference between, let's say, my party, the PSL, and some of the other parties is not really always about the slogans. A lot of times the slogans seem almost identical. It's about the orientation and emphasis about who's the leadership. Where liberal groups, you mentioned the NGOs, they're always thinking like, how can we get the liberal wing of the Democratic Party to be more liberal? How can we get the bourgeois liberals to be better? Why aren't they better? Why don't they have a spine? You know, like all of these ridiculous notions that somehow our class enemy is going to get better because they're liberal. When in fact, they're not going to get better. They're going to get worse unless there's like the heat, the fire from below. And Lenin said, no, the leadership of the anti-Tsarist revolution, because Lenin wasn't thinking in 1903 or 4 or 5, this is going to be a socialist revolution. He said it's going to be an anti-Tsarist revolution to create a republican form of government, a non-monarchical form of government, but it will be led by the workers and poor peasants. He called it the democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry. And so the two wings of the movement, the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks, really all the way through, from here all the way to 1917 and the revolution, it's who's going to lead the revolution. So when the February Revolution happened in 1917 and overthrew the Tsar, the Mensheviks supported the provisional government. Lenin said, let's overthrow it. Let's get rid of it. Let's have a socialist government. And they were like, the Mensheviks were like, but we all agreed this was going to be the bourgeois democratic stage of the revolution. And Lenin said, yes, it is, and it's over. And they said, it was 3 months, the bourgeois democratic stage? And Lenin said, yes. And he was right, because the bourgeois democratic forces in 1917, like 1905, like 1870, were so weak in Russia that they always capitulated. They didn't have the revolutionary fervor of the French bourgeoisie in 1870 in 1789 or 93 or 94, wherever you want to end the French Revolution. These people were tied to imperialism. The imperialists in France, Britain, and the United States said, stay in the war. So the bourgeois liberals said, stay in the war. And the Mensheviks were following them, because the Mensheviks said, this is the bourgeois democratic revolution. It's not our turn. This is going to be the evolution of the bourgeois stage. And Lenin said, that's not the evolution of anything. That's counter-revolution. To stay in the war is counter-revolution. So you can have all of your Marxist formulas about what stage we're in history, but the only way to get out of the war and the only way for the peasants to eat is for the proletariat and poor peasantry to be the leadership. That's the real difference between the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks. And you wouldn't know that in 1903. You couldn't know it. It had to show itself over a course of events, 1905, 1907, 1914, where the Mensheviks support the war, then the revolution itself, where they support the provisional government. So that's the real difference between the Mensheviks and Bolsheviks.
How big was the Central Committee and
This group, their central committee was, they called it the editorial board at that time. At that moment, Lenin wanted to make it 3 people. These people wanted to make it 7. But it all was very small, because they were all had to function underground or in exile. That's why it was so small.
the Congress?
The Congress was about 60 people, also quite small.
How were they elected?
They had delegates from different units of the parties. There were about 5 different parties that made up the Russian Social Democratic Party. So they each got a certain number of delegates, depending on how many members they had.
So I see 1 and 2 hand, and then here in the back as well. So maybe we can start with these 2 and then go back here.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Comrade, for this class. My name is Salma. I'm also an organizer with the PSL. And I really appreciate how you spoke about how the Bolsheviks were able to seize the moment, the historical moment. And I'm kind of curious if you could share a little bit about whether there are other moments in American history where we missed that opportunity. But also, I mean, how does all of that connect to the moment that we're experiencing right now with all the revolutionary energy around the Palestinian resistance and the Palestine solidarity movement? Yeah, thank you.
Well, very quickly, there haven't really been the necessary circumstances in the U.S. There have been periods where there was kind of pre-revolutionary moments, like in the 1930s, where capitalism was paralyzed. But the World War II solved the problem of capitalism because it revived the capitalist economy through militarization. All the unemployed could go become soldiers, and their spouses could go work in factories. And so the war economy saved capitalism at that moment. And that's why the military-industrial complex was revived 5 years after the end of World War II, because the economy was slipping back into depression again by 1948. So the U.S. created a permanent military machine. So it's funded like there's a war, even though there's not a war. So that's the military-industrial complex, this endless funding for war to stabilize capitalism. The most revolutionary moment in U.S. history, I would say, was when it was because of the counter-revolution waged by the slaveocracy when it tried to secede from the Union in 1861 and created the Confederacy. But that did not lead to a revolutionary moment until 1863 with the Emancipation Proclamation, which allowed black slaves, enslaved people, and people who were running from their plantations to pick up the gun. And hundreds of thousands of black people in the South picked up the gun. And that's why the North won the war. It was the tenacity, the endurance, the steadfastness, the courage, the militancy of black soldiers, many white soldiers too, but in particular, the armed uprising that became a freedom struggle. And that was the most revolutionary period in U.S. history. And that led to the Reconstruction period, which was then crushed by counter-revolution. But it was the most hopeful moment in U.S. history. It was also the bloodiest war the U.S. has ever fought. Even in World War II, 400,000 U.S. soldiers died. The number of U.S. dead in the Civil War is 650,000 when the country was 30 million people as opposed to 160 million people. So the tenacity, the militancy of the struggle between revolution and counter-revolution, what made it the most, I would say, revolutionary moment in U.S. history. Crushed in blood, unfortunately. We think there will be other moments coming, though, which is why we form a party. If we thought there was no prospect for revolution in the U.S., why build a Marxist party? You could build all kinds of organizations that are a lot less complicated to build than a communist or socialist party, multinational socialist party. We did it with the PSL because when we started 20 years ago in 2004, and it was just a handful of us, we believed that the crisis of capitalism and imperialism would create revolutionary moments like what happened in 1917. The three factors that we think were going to create a revolutionary crisis in the United States are endless war, which is growing, and the danger of global war. Secondly, uncontrolled climate catastrophe, environmental catastrophe, solvable or at least mitigatable, but not by capitalism because the profit motive is the determinant decision maker. And thirdly, artificial intelligence, which in the next decade will wipe out 60% of the existing jobs. And under capitalism, if you lose your job, as we know, after 6 months of unemployment, you're on your own. And that's why the crisis of endless war, climate catastrophe, and artificial intelligence all coming at once at the moment that the U.S. political system is already deeply destabilized, I think will open up real revolutionary prospects. But again, if we don't have a party or an organization, you might say, well, I don't agree with PSL. Well, form another party then. But you need organization to win. If it's just spontaneous, we're going to come to demonstrations, they get bigger and bigger, and then they get smaller. You can't win. You have to have organization to win. So that was why we started PSL, was we felt movements are going to come. A lot of them are going to come. We saw there was the anti-war movement, then the immigrant rights movement, then the Occupy movement, then Ferguson and the Black Lives Matter movement, then the Bernie Sanders campaign. and how people became socialist, and the 2020 uprising. Now you see this massive movement shift in consciousness in the last 7 weeks on Palestine. There's these detonators that keep going off, creating mass movements, but the mass movement by itself doesn't make the difference. You have to have organizations, so we learn the lessons when the ebb tide comes. We learn the lessons, we train people, we are ready for the next upsurge. But clearly the crises of capitalism will lead to, we believe, firmly believe that will lead to revolutionary situation.
Okay, I'm going to take a look at the hands again. One here, and then if we can take a comment in the back on this side so we get the other sides as well. Yeah.
I'm just wondering if you could lay out a little bit for us what are the contemporary manifestations of Menshevism and populism. I mean, was the old CP Menshevik? Is Hamas Narodnik? I don't know what connections I'm just really interested in where you see these non-ML forces today.
I don't want to unnecessarily provoke fights. I mean, I would be glad to talk. I really don't, because I don't want to digress into because without a thorough discussion, it sounds like, oh, I'm calling somebody a Menshevik, and I don't want to do that. There are many differences in the movement. We all have to look at them and analyze them. There's also, I would say in general, people who believe that you must support the Democratic Party and you must try to build a liberal wing of the Democratic Party as the road for progress, I would consider that to be a kind of Menshevism. I'm not going to name names because it's not the point. The point is the thesis. When Bernie Sanders announced he was running in 2016, along with Lenin, in 2016, as I was saying, when Bernie announced his campaign, nobody thought it was going to do very well. He hasn't done anything in the Senate. And he was like 70, by then he was like 70-year-old white guy, not really a radical, even though he was a self-proclaimed independent socialist. But millions of young people started to flock to the Bernie campaign rally. And so we in the PSL, we were like, you can do two things with the Bernie Sanders campaign. You can emphasize that Bernie Sanders has consistently voted for an imperialist foreign policy, that he's not going to really break from the Democrats, that if he doesn't win the nomination, he's going to end up supporting Hillary Clinton. We can emphasize all of these rotten things that are true about Bernie Sanders, or we could say how wonderful and hopeful it is that millions of young people are coming towards Bernie Sanders because he said he's a socialist and they are now open-minded to socialism. We decided tactically to emphasize the positive element of the Bernie Sanders campaign without having any illusions about it, because we said to people, the things that you like about Bernie are the things that we like about socialism. You want free healthcare for all, affordable housing, canceling student debt, those are the things we want. So we kind of went through the experience with people, and then at the end, when they saw that Bernie basically sold out, and then in 2020 was crushed and then still sold out, people could see that we weren't like these other socialist groups that stood on the sidelines and said, oh, Bernie Sanders is going to just sell you out. Bernie Sanders is an imperialist. Bernie Sanders is sheepdogging people into the Democratic Party, just emphasizing all that stuff. And what people could see is in good faith, we were in the same movement that they were in. We said, we're not Bernie Sanders supporters, we're not Democrats, but we support the same issues. We're for these things. So we built a lot of bridges into that movement. And when Bernie Sanders sold out, basically, huge numbers of people from that movement joined the party, because they knew that what we had done, We even put out a newspaper in where our office was in East Harlem. And if I have some of the facts here wrong, just correct me, some of the comrades here in New York. We put out a newspaper. We said, we're not, along with other, not just PSL people, we said, look, we're not Democrats. We're not voting in the primary. But if you're a Democrat and you're voting in the primary, vote for Bernie Sanders. And we distributed those all over East Harlem. East Harlem was the only place that Bernie Sanders won the primary in New York City. And if I'm making this up, somebody should correct me, but I think I'm not making it up. I think it's correct. But it showed that the campaign, like what we were doing was in good faith reaching into this new development. Socialism was crushed after World War II. It was crushed in America by the witch hunt. The left was strong in America. The Communist Party had 100,000 members. There was 1 million people who sympathized with that. And everything was driven underground and dispersed, and people to live had to say, I'm not a socialist. All the communists pretended to be liberal Methodists or liberal United Church of Christ people. And after a decade, they were. As Kurt Vonnegut said, you are what you pretend to be, so be careful when you pretend. But, Bernie lifted the taboo a little bit. Anderson Cooper on the first debate on CNN, if you remember it, November 2015, not 1915, 2015, he said to Bernie Sanders, you can't be president, you're a socialist. And Bernie said, well, I'll tell you why we're going to win. We're going to win because we want to cancel student debt. We want to have affordable health care, affordable housing. We want health care for all. That should be a right, blah, blah, blah. And they thought that Anderson Cooper thought this was going to be the anti-communist knockout punch against Bernie. And in that debate, in the next 3 hours, $3 or $4 million in small donations came into the Sanders campaign. And Sanders took off. So the anti-communism didn't work. That's what we saw in the early Sanders campaign, was the hopefulness. And we said, this is something different. This is the taboo is lifting on socialism. So obviously, for a socialist party to get stronger, socialism itself has to become less demonized, less caricatured, more available in debate. And to the extent that it has, it's very welcome. And so as we're getting, our movement is just kind of getting its legs, we're also careful not to go at people like other socialists who we don't necessarily agree with. Our emphasis is, let's find the things that we do agree about. If the things are really bad that we don't agree about, like if you support, sending money to Israel right now, yeah, we're not friends. But, if you say ceasefire now as opposed to some other slogan for the movement, why fight each other? We're on the same side. That's our orientation generally.
Hello, comrades. Brian, thank you so much. I've genuinely learned so much just from tonight. I have 2 questions. Pick which of them you'd like to answer. One applies to the modern, one is a historical question. The first is, in the articles we had for the pre-readings, it mentioned that Lenin mentions one of the keys to the success for the transition between the provisional government to a socialist one from 1914 revolution to the 1917 revolution was the establishment and maintenance of the Soviets. What would that look like? What would we need to do here to establish or create our own Soviets? Is that possible? And my second question would be, so in reference, you mentioned that United States actually kind of had World War II revive its capitalist system, versus where in Russia what led to and allowed for the revolution was World War I and the revolutionary defeat of the Tsarist government. Why was it that the United States was able to revive its economy, whereas in Russia it destroyed it?
Yeah, okay. I'll take the second question first. The difference is the U.S. won the war. So at the end of World War II, Germany and Japan, the enemies, their cities were in ruins. They were destroyed. The U.S. carpet bombed. Before the U.S. dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it firebombed all the other cities. I mean, it actually kept Hiroshima and Nagasaki separate and didn't firebomb them so that it could gauge the impact of the atomic bomb, have a clean laboratory experiment, basically. That's why they bombed them last. But Japan was in ruins, Germany was in ruins, 8 million dead. France, all of Europe was in ruins. The United States was the only main belligerent in World War II that did not have the war on its own soil. So American factories were not burned down. They were not bombed. They were humming. They were producing the war materials for the war. It actually functioned as a full employment economy. And unlike the devastation, horribleness, the magnitude of the violence unmatched in human history. So the U.S. won the war, and the U.S. could then the U.S. had 4% of the world's population in 1945 and was producing 50% of the world's products, goods and services. One out of every two, by a population that constituted 4% of the world's people. That was an enormous privilege. The U.S. also could dictate the terms of the peace. So it said, we're going to create a UN, which we will dominate. We'll create a World Bank, which we will dominate. We'll create an international monetary fund, which we will dominate. And guess what, everybody? There's a new world currency. It's called the US dollar. That was also at the end of World War II from the Bretton Woods Conference. So where the rest of the countries of the world had to buy dollars to do trade in dollars, the US could print dollars. That's a pretty big privilege where you can just print and everybody else has to buy. So the US then was able to not only win the war, vanquish its enemies, but reorganize the capitalist system. And instead of punishing Germany and Japan, it brought Germany and Japan into revive the capitalist ruling class in Japan and Germany, and said, look, we're not going to do to you what the victors did to Germany after World War I with the Versailles Treaty and all the sanctions. We're going to actually let Japan revive its economy, and you're going to get a big piece of the market, including you can sell transistor radios in the United States. Japan was like China's economy today, or in the last 20 years, exporting low-cost consumer commodities into the U.S. in the 1940s, 50s, 60s. And so they revived Japan, they revived Germany, and they also consecrated the alliance with the European allies by expanding NATO, by creating NATO. So NATO was a US-led alliance, Britain, France, Italy, Belgium. The vanquished enemies were brought into the world market. They were all revived. That's why the US could succeed. The only condition for Germany and Japan and the others was, we can give you a piece of the world market, we're going to help revive your ruling class. The only thing you have to do is never challenge us. Give up your sovereignty. Yes, you're big capitalist powers. Yes, you used to be empires, but now you do what America says. And what we mainly want you to do is fight global communism and to fight the anti-colonial struggles of the people in Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, and Asia. If you do that, we're buds, we're friends. And since that time, there hasn't been a repeat of World War I and World War II. When you go to the United Nations, if you go over here, it says the motto over the door was, end the scourge of war. That was ending the scourge of war between the imperialists. It wasn't ending the scourge of war against the people the imperialists targeted. Because the imperialists targeted the people in Korea. 26 countries invaded. They targeted Vietnam. They targeted the Congo. They targeted Guatemala. They targeted Iran. They targeted any people or country that wanted to be free and independent. But they didn't want to fight each other, because when they fought each other after World War I, it led to the Russian Revolution. What happened after World War II? The Chinese Revolution, the Korean Revolution, the Vietnamese Revolution, the Indonesian freedom struggle. India almost had a revolution. There was the revolutions all over the world because the capitalist system had weakened. So the U.S., as the victor of World War II, decided on a new world order. It would revive all of the major capitalist powers. They would be not punished. They would be integrated into the world economy as long as they sacrificed sovereignty and basically functioned as part of an anti-communist united front against the Soviet Union, China, in the other socialist countries. That was the pro-war quid pro quo. That's why it wasn't like it was elsewhere. In terms of Soviet, Soviet is the Russian word for council. The Bolsheviks did not create the Soviets. The Mensheviks did not create the Soviets. The working class created the Soviets. Workers themselves, self-acting workers who were pissed off, enraged about so many different issues. When the revolution in 1905 happened, by the way, I didn't mention why it happened. I'll just finish with this. The peasants and some of the workers went to the Tsar in 1905 to the Winter Palace and said, "We have a petition, please hear us, we're hungry. We need land." And the Tsar's military forces massacred them when they were bringing a peaceful petition. Their language was "Dear Father." They were calling the Tsar their father, and they were massacred. And that's what started the 1905, that was the trigger for the 1905 revolution. And the masses poured out, and they said, well, there's no Congress, there's no parliament, there's no civil liberties, there's no civil rights. What are we going to do? They formed councils, Soviets. So they were self-created organizations of a people that were looking to speak. And in those Soviets, the Social Democrats like Lenin, the Bolsheviks said, oh, those could become a future government. They don't simply have to be protest groups. The Soviets could rule. So when the February Revolution happened in 1917, Lenin's slogan was, all power to the Soviets, not all power to the Bolsheviks. And at the time when they said it, the Bolsheviks were still a minority in the Soviets. The Mensheviks, the social revolutionaries, and the other groups were stronger. Only in September, October did the Soviets become dominated by the Bolsheviks because the Bolsheviks were the only anti-war party. That's how that actually happened. Can we create Soviets? Yeah, let's do it, everybody. Let's create councils where self-acting people say, we want to speak, we'll create our own power, we're going to create a dual power, we'll create a rival power, and eventually that can be the power. That's actually how revolutions happen. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Brian, for such an engaging class session. Thank you, everybody, for participating. I know there were still a lot more questions in the room and many more in the chat. So I want to ask all of you to actually write down your questions. Actually, take a minute right now, write them down, email them to us, education@peoplesforum.org. There's so many people that are participating in the class, so we can't get to all of them, but we can certainly engage you on them and then try to fold them into upcoming sessions. So please write them down, send them to us. We'll see you next week. Same time, Tuesday, 6:30 p.m.
I'm going to use slides.
We'll use slides next week. And in the meantime, for those of you in New York, we are going to be at Columbus Circle tomorrow evening at 7 p.m. at the end of what's going to be a long day of beautiful and very diverse actions all day. Tomorrow is the International Day of Solidarity for the Palestinian people, and it is also an International Day of Action for Palestine called by the Shut It Down Coalition. So people will be, if you're watching from other places, you can go to shutitdownforpalestine.org. We'll put the website in the chat, and find an action near you or organize one. And if you're in New York, after you spend all day doing many actions, come to the vigil that we're going to be hosting for the 20,000 martyrs, and the list is still growing, of the Palestinian people. And we're going to continue mobilizing. So please join us. We'll have a volunteer meeting for those who want to get more involved in the movement on Monday, next Monday. Every Monday we have meetings here. So with that, thank you. We'll be around if you want to chat. And we'll see you all next week. And thank you, Brian.
Thank you.